Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We're looking at the words of Solomon as he writes by inspiration towards the end of his life, and how that he is concluding some things that he has observed. Of course, his conclusions are by the inspiration of God, but some of the things that he writes by inspiration in the book of Ecclesiastes sound kind of pessimistic. And there's a reason for that. In our sermon this morning, we talked about being optimistic, having a positive attitude. But Solomon is writing from a almost negative or a pessimistic viewpoint because of the things that he has observed and because of the mistakes he has made. And he's basically saying a life without God, no matter what you accomplish, is meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. And so he's making some observations and he's talking about it. Chapter 8 and verse 10. He said, "Then I saw the wicked buried, who has come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity." There's one of our key words throughout the book, vanity, uselessness. Verse 11, "Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men are fully set in them to do evil." So you have this attitude among the wicked, just because God doesn't strike a person down and send them into judgment immediately for their sin, they are rushing headlong, as it were. Their heart is fully set on doing evil. So it's kind of the attitude of, I'm getting away with it. I'm getting away with doing what I'm doing. And so it's something that the person is deceived by. And they are deceived, of course, by the devil who tempts them to do evil. And they think they're getting away with evil, but they're not going to get away with it. That's the thing that Solomon finally, he realizes and finally concludes. They're not really going to get away with it. Even though they think they're getting away with it, they're not. Ultimately, judgment will come. Sometimes judgment comes in this life, but most certainly it will come on the day of judgment. Judgment sometimes comes in this life to a certain degree, but it will definitely come at the end of time. Verse 12, "Though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God and fear before Him." So again, he's looking at things he's observed, but he's realizing something. Even though a person, a sinner, does an evil thing 100 times and lives a long life in doing it, they're not going to get away with it. Judgment will come. It is well with those who fear God and fear before Him. That word fear means to have an awesome respect and reverence before God that motivates the person to love God and to do His will. So basically what he's saying in the latter part of verse 13 is, the one who is really successful, the one who's really going to win in the long run, is the one who fears God and does His will, even though it may seem under the sun, or from our vantage point here on earth, that sometimes the wicked seem as though they're getting away with it and they live a long life. That's just not the case. Verse 14, "There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. And again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. And I said that this also is vanity." In other words, he's observing and he says, here's what I've seen. There are just or righteous people, and it seems like that all they have is trouble. All they have is hardship. Everything goes wrong. And then you see this wicked person over here, and it seems like that God's blessing them. Nothing's going wrong. Everything's going smoothly in their life, seemingly. and they're going to get away with it. You have a person who becomes a Christian, they're obedient to the will of God, and they have cancer or they get some sort of disease, and they have a miserable, painful existence from that point on, and then they might even die at a young age, and then you have a person who's living in wickedness who never gets sick, even though they have damaged their body with drugs and alcohol and smoking and things of that nature, and they live to be 100 years old. And Solomon, is, in essence, is saying, it just doesn't seem fair. But he says also, this is vanity, verse 14. Because that's how it appears on earth. That's how it appears on earth. Think about the suffering and the death of Christ. Under the sun, the way it appeared on earth, it seemed like Christ lost. I mean, here's a preacher, he's a young preacher, going about preaching and performing all kinds of miracles, raising the dead, healing the sick, multiplying food, doing all these things. Then he is arrested, he is abused, he is scourged, he is crucified, and he's killed. And so people look at that who are not spiritually minded or don't know the will of God and say, well, he failed. No, he didn't. That was a victory. He conquered death through his resurrection. But from that vantage point on earth, well, you know, he had all this power. What did they say about him when he was hanging on the cross? He saved others. Himself he cannot save. As they were taunting him when he was hanging on the cross. The religious leaders were further taunting him. See, they were looking at Christ on the cross, and they were seeing a big failure. But spiritually speaking, it was a victory. It was the only way of salvation. It was God's will. So it's how you look at things, and the person, as I gave that first illustration, who becomes a Christian and they're young, but they get cancer or get a terrible disease and they suffer. Yet through that suffering, through that hardship, they grow closer to God, and when they die, they're going to paradise. That doesn't deter them. They're going to a better place. Then you have the wicked person who lives 100 years, does wicked, ungodly things, and seems to make a lot of money, seems to have no hardship. When they die, they're going to burn for eternity in hell. So really, it's well with those who fear God, no matter how long they live. Look at verse 15. So I commended in enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun. There's that key phrase, under the sun, how things appear on earth, than to eat, drink, and be merry, for this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. This is a phrase that's often repeated. There's nothing better than to eat, drink, and be merry. But it's also coupled with verse 13, the one who fears God. So here's what really enjoyment in life, and joy in life, and rejoicing in life, and being happy, the pursuit of happiness. Here's what it's all about. You drink and you be merry and you remain with him, for this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life which God gives him under the sun. So when a person has that focus on spiritual things, then come what may, they're going to be okay. They have all the blessings of God here in this life, even though they might go through hardship. And the Bible makes it very clear that the hardship that we struggle with helps us grow stronger. Helps us to endure, helps us to persevere, and that makes heaven that much more glorious because of what we suffer here upon the earth. That's a very good point. The bad things or the good things that happen to bad people, as was pointed out, the devil already has bad people. He already has them. They're in his control. He already has the unfaithful child of God. He already has the people who have never been converted. He has them. And the hardships that a Christian faces may be an onslaught, so to speak, from the devil. And in a way that's true, because when a person's going along to get along with everyone else, life is easier. But when you become a Christian and you start standing up for what is right, you're going to meet resistance. Sometimes from your own brethren, sometimes from your own family members, and certainly from the world. Because you're not going along to get along. I've said this before, it's easy to go to hell. Don't do anything. Don't stand up for what's right. Do what everyone else is doing in society. That's easy. And you'll be lost. But to live the Christian life and to do what is right, you're going to meet resistance. I mean, you look at Christ. He met resistance with the religious leaders. In fact, it was the religious leaders that gave him the most trouble. In fact, they were the ones that wanted him killed. He met resistance with them. Look at the Apostle Paul. Things were going well, in his career, so to speak, before he was converted. Then when he became a Christian, his fellow countrymen wanted him dead. And he received persecution from city to city, town to town that he went to, because he wasn't going along to get along anymore. And they considered him a traitor. So in a very real sense, you look at Job, of course, you see Job as one who suffered. And God says he's not suffering because he's done anything wrong. He's a righteous man. He's upright. He feared God. And the devil says, let me at him, as it were. Let me throw all this at him and see if he'll remain faithful to you. And he did. He had a lot of questions, didn't understand. But he did remain faithful, even though he was hit by every conceivable, imaginable pain and suffering that a person could endure from the devil. And I believe that is a good point. Look at verse 16. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 16. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night. Verse 17. Then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. Here's some of these difficult passages that we talked about last week. What in the world is being said here? I think he's talking about when a person is trying to seek out everything that there is to know under the sun, you're not going to know it. There's a limit to what you can know. There's a limit to what you can find out. Even though you labor at doing this day and night, no sleep, day or night, to see what goes on under the sun, you cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. You're not going to be able to discover it all. Look at chapter 9 and verse 1. Right. The wise man knows and understands there's more to learn, there's more to know, and that you'll never stop learning. But you're not going to know everything. And that's the amazing thing to me, verse 16 and 17, when you look at these scientists and philosophers who think up until this point, in 2005, they've got it figured out. They know all there is to know pretty much. And yet they'll make a discovery sometime this year that will contradict something that was a long-held view for a long time. I mean, you can't help think about the theory of evolution that is really in a state of turmoil in the scientific community now. There's a lot of discoveries, especially since we can peer and look deep into the inner workings of DNA and things of that nature, that the scientists are saying, hey, wait a minute, this could not have evolved So it's turning upside down the long-held theory that people hold to and think, well, this is how it happened. Got it all figured out. Well, no. Look at chapter 9 and verse 1. For I considered all this in my heart, so that I could declare it to all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. So Solomon is saying, this is what I've observed, righteousness and the wise and their work is in the hand of God. God is with those, and He is in. He holds them in their hands, so to speak. And people neither know love nor hatred by anything they see before them. In other words, you can't look around you and see love in its ultimate sense, because there can be deception there. A person can appear to love someone else, but it's not true love. There's a motive behind it that's not loving. Verse 2, all things come alike to all. What he's going to talk about here in chapter 9 is death, basically. Here's something that we're all going to face. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As it is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears no oath. So he's saying, here's the one thing that's going to happen to everyone. Someone who's very religious, very devout, very dedicated. They make the sacrifices. Of course, that would be under the Old Testament law. Someone who fears the oath. They take seriously their commitment. And to the person who does not sacrifice, they don't care. They don't care about oaths. They're unclean. So this is the one thing that's going to happen to all. Verse 3. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun. There's that phrase, under the sun. That one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. He's already concluded in the chapter before, chapter 7 and verse 20, there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. The problem of sin, he says here, verse 3. And here's what's going to happen to all. He says, truly the hearts of the Son of Men are full of evil. There's wickedness in the human life. Madness is in their hearts. And after that, they all go to the dead. What's very interesting is when you read the genealogies that are found, you find them in Genesis and other passages of the Old Testament. It says, this person lived such and such a number of years, begat sons and daughters, and then he died. That's always the conclusion of everyone. And then he died. Doesn't matter if they were wicked. It doesn't matter if they were good. And then he died. It doesn't matter if they lived 969 years like Methuselah. And then he died. Only two that didn't. Enoch and Elijah. They are the exception to the rule. And then he died. Look at verse 4, Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 4. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. You have to understand that dog here refers to a despised, contemptible animal. It was not a pet type dog that people think are cuddly and they put collars on. Some people put ribbons on and put clothes on. You know how people are with their animals. Dogs in this context here is referring to the animals that run stray throughout the streets that are diseased animals, and they're not kept for pets. They are animals that would attack livestock and animals that were a nuisance, in other words. But he's saying here in verse 4, for him who is joined to all the living, he who is still alive, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. Now, a lion in Scriptures represents power, majesty, strength. Christ is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Power, royalty, something majestic. But what good is a dead one? A dead lion, you have no power there. You have no majesty there. It's dead. So basically what he's saying here, while there is still life, in this life there is still hope. Even though we're all heading to one place, to the dead, Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed that a man wants to die, and then comes the judgment. Even though even the wicked and the righteous are heading to the place of the dead, verse 4, yet in this life there is still hope, even for the most contemptible person, the dog. As we were studying the book of Revelation on Wednesday nights, it talked about outside of heaven, those who are in hell, those who are not in the presence of God. It describes dogs. It's not talking about furry animals. The dogs literally, in the literal sense. It's talking about people who are contemptible. People who never, ever had or rather took the opportunity to avail themselves of God's grace and mercy so they wouldn't be a dog anymore. So they would be a Christian and go to heaven. But in the land of the living, he's saying in verse 4, there is still hope, because a dead lion is finished with. Dead lion's dead. But a living dog, there is hope. So basically, I believe what he's saying here, there is hope in the land of the living. Basically, the Scriptures tell us that once a person dies, their spiritual condition is sealed and there's no reversing it. That's why in this life you've got to get right with God, because there's no second chance. And so he's basically saying that in this time there is hope. But after that, all hope is gone. For Adolf Hitler, there is no hope. For Saddam Hussein, there still is hope. He's still alive. He may be a dog, spiritually speaking, but there's still hope. He can obey the gospel and be just as saved as you and I by the grace and mercy of God. But for someone like Adolf Hitler, there's no hope. Time's up. Verse 5 and 6 have been passages that have been misused by various religious groups, and unfortunately by some misinformed brethren. Notice what it says, verse 5. For the living know that they will die. That goes along with what he said in verse 4. There is hope because the living know that they will die. Knowing that they will die helps them understand the seriousness of their spiritual condition and say, okay, I better straighten up. I better get right with God. For the living know that they will die, verse 5, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward. For the memory of them is forgotten, verse 6. Also their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun. He said the dead know nothing. But wait a minute. Jesus said in Luke chapter 16 concerning the rich man and Lazarus that the rich man knew he was in torment and Lazarus knew he was in paradise or in Abraham's bosom after they had died. How can that be reconciled with what's going on here in chapter 9? Any thoughts? The key phrase is in verse 6. In anything done under the sun. In other words, that's how it appears on earth. That's how it appears on earth. The dead know nothing. The dead are all the things that they were involved in are no more. They perish under the sun, the things that are done here in this life. So when, if you're ever studying with a Jehovah's Witness or a Seventh-day Adventist who believe in when you die, you cease to exist, they will go to passages like this and try to say, see, here, the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing. So after you die, there's no more existence. That's their point. But they miss the whole point of what Solomon's trying to say. Concerning the things, verse 6, that are done under the sun, the dead have nothing to do with the things done under the sun. Have nothing to do with what's going on earth. The memory of them is forgotten. Verse 6, also the love, the hatred, their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything under the sun or on earth. This tells me the dead, after they depart, have no dealings with anything on earth. You know, sometimes I jokingly say when something goes kind of strange in the house where I'm living, this place is haunted. I say that jokingly. According to this verse here, the dead have nothing to do with what's going on earth anymore. They're not haunting houses. They're not haunting trains. They're not haunting lighthouses. You know, you see these things on TV where you got graveyards and people think the dead are walking around in the graveyard and all that. The dead have nothing to do with what's going on earth anymore. And no, there's not a person on earth that can communicate with the dead. They were called mediums, spiritists in the Old Testament. In fact, it was against God's law, and those who practiced them were to be put to death under the law of Moses. You got these television shows where a person thinks that they can contact the dead loved ones and so forth. And what they do, they ask the person they're talking to, they fish for questions from them. That's what they're doing. They're fishing for questions. They're charlatans. They're just like any magician that can use sleight of hand or can use words to manipulate people. And people say, oh, they're contacting my great-grandmother, you know. And people fall for it. That's a good point. Saul is an exception. What was that? 1 Samuel 28, I believe it was, where you have Saul consulting Samuel after his death. Is it chapter 28? Yeah. 1 Samuel chapter 28. We talked about this in the past. And I want you to notice verse 11. The story goes, Saul goes to a medium, verse 7, or a witch, some translations might say, of Endor. He wants to consult with Samuel. Samuel's dead. He is dead. Saul wants to know how a battle is going to go. Verse 8. So Saul disguised himself, put on other clothes. He didn't want to have his royal clothing on, but he was sneaking out, and went with 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night and said to her, please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you. Then the woman said to him, look, you know that Saul has done what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? So the woman knew, this medium knew that what she was doing was against the law. Verse 10, and Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Verse 11, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. Verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And notice that in verse 12. It scared her to death. I'm convinced this is the first time it actually happened. In other words, all the other times she was tricking people, like these people do on television and such. But God allowed this to happen to get a message to Saul. So she was just as surprised when it actually happened as everyone else. Mm-hmm. Right. And he said, verse 12, and the woman saw Samuel, cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Again, she would have been afraid. Verse 13, and the king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth. Verse 14, so he said to her, what is its form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. And then, verse 15, Samuel said, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? So here is an incident in which I believe God allowed this to happen. I don't think this was the norm. God wanted to get a message across, and God in His sovereignty could do this. I don't believe this was a normal thing. This was one of those things that's a kind of an exception to the rule, kind of like what we talked about earlier. You live and you die, but there are two exceptions. Enoch and Elijah, they're exceptions to the rule. They didn't die. God took them. And so I believe that incident right there is showing the levels that Saul would stoop to. He'd already become pretty corrupt by this time. But yet he still had an inkling of spiritual longing. He wanted to know what Samuel had to say concerning this. And notice this. He knows that God had already departed him, so he's not going to God for counsel. He's going to a witch, a medium, for counsel. But yet God used that situation to get a message across to him anyway. But under normal circumstances, I believe what is going on in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 6 is that they have no share in anything under the sun. So when the dead pass on to the place of the dead, when the spirit goes on to the Hadean realm, they have no activity here on earth. And that's exactly what he's saying here in verse 5 and 6. The living know that they will die. But the dead here on earth, they know nothing. That's why it speaks of the body as sleeping in the Bible. Both Old and New Testament talks about death as a sleep. But it's not talking about the spirit. It's talking about the body, because that is the appearance that the body is sleeping. Look at verse 7 and 8. Ecclesiastes 9. Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. So verse 7 and 8 is talking about enjoying life. Eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart. Well, is he talking about an intoxicating wine here? I don't believe so, because of what was said by Solomon in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 29 through 35, in which Solomon said, stay away from intoxicating wine. Don't even look at it. I don't believe he would contradict himself. As we said before, the word wine has various meanings. It means either a good wine, referring to something that doesn't intoxicate, the juice of a grape, or it's referring to something that is bad and is intoxicating. And I believe in the case here, he's not referring to anything that's harmful, but the juice of a grape. Verse 9. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all the days of vanity, for that is your portion in life and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Notice what he says in verse 9. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love. He uses wife in the singular. How many wives did Solomon have? He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which are kind of a second-class wife. So he had 1,000 wives, so to speak. Yet by inspiration, he says, live with your wife. Singular. That's God's intent. One man, one woman for life. Sometimes these writers of the Bible didn't practice what they wrote by inspiration. He's saying here, here's God's intent. One man, one woman. Live with the wife whom you love. And you notice when you study the book Song of Solomon, he deals with that marriage love between one man and one woman. A marriage love that's found there in the book of Song of Solomon. So he's saying here, you live joyfully. There's that optimism. You live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. And that, in other words, it's a life commitment. One man, one woman for life. Which he has given you under the sun all the days of your vanity, for this is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. Again, talking about the grave, death, things as far as here on earth. In the grave, in that condition, in the grave, there is no knowledge, there is no work, there is no device, there is no wisdom in the grave. Not talking about the spirit realm where the spirit goes after death, but in the grave, here on earth, under the sun, when you die, it's all over. That's why he said earlier in the book, remember when he talked about when we die just like the animals die? We're going to die just like the animal dies. But, seeing it from a spiritual point of view, we have a spirit that's going to go on into the next life. And so he's saying here in verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Put everything into it. Whatever you find to do, do it with your might. Do the Lord's will with your might. Give 100%. What they say in the sports realm, the coaches, what do they say? Give 110%. You put effort into what you're doing. Not a half-hearted endeavor. You put effort into it, and especially into the spiritual realm. You know, as far as the physical realm, as far as things that are done under the sun, the Christian should be the best worker an employer has. Because of all these principles, both in the Old and New Testament, this worker is going to be diligent. He's going to be submissive. He's not going to be disrespectful. He's not going to do anything wrong. But yet when the boss tells him to do something, he will say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and do it. That's the ethic of working hard that you find all throughout the Scriptures. He won't be a slacker. He will be diligent in what he does. Does it with all of his might. Because he says in verse 10, you're heading to the grave. You're going to die, in other words. Verse 11, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. In other words, under the sun, the way things go, the race is not always to the swift. You have someone, you think of it in the terms of a race, you have someone that's sure to win a race, and you know they're going to win. They're faster than all the racers. But when they run, they stumble and fall and hurt themselves. By chance, something like that happens. So not always the fastest runner wins the race. There's something that can deter that, or there's something that can derail that general rule that the fastest runner will win the race. The battle is not always to the strong. You can have a strong army going against a weaker nation, but there could be something that happens that causes that strong army not to prevail. And riches to men of understanding. So you can have a person who doesn't have, or does have understanding rather, and yet they don't receive the riches or what they expect as far as riches. Nor favor to men of skill. Someone can be very skillful, very good at what they do, but they cannot have favor with men. For example, you're working in a company, you know you can do a certain job, and you could probably do it better than some of the others who are higher ups. But you can't advance because you don't have a degree. You already know you can do the job, but you don't have the piece of paper that says you have this level of education. So, favor to the man of skill. You're going to miss out on that promotion, even though you can do the job, no doubt about it. But you don't have that piece of paper that says that you've got this level of education, therefore you cannot receive that promotion. But he says, a time and chance happen to them all. Verse 12, for man also does not know his time. What time is he talking about? What time? Death. In context here. Man does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. You don't know the time of your death. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, we cited this before. It's appointed unto men once to die, and after that the judgment. Nobody knows the time of their own death. So it's one of those things where he's saying, basically, you better live your life to the fullest. You better take advantage of every opportunity to be right with God. You better enjoy the life that you have, and what you find to do it with all your might, because sometimes life doesn't always happen the way we think it should happen under the sun, and we don't know our time. I plan on living to be 100, but I could die tomorrow. We don't know. We must always be ready for that time. We'll continue this next week.